Please don't let him kill me." Those were the words my daughter whispered into the phone the night everything finally broke apart. I can still hear the terror in her voice. Behind her there was the sound of glass shattering, a man screaming in rage, and the heavy thud of furniture sliding across the floor. By the time I reached her house 10 minutes later, my son-in-law Brad Jenkins was lying face down on his own kitchen floor, with my knee pressed firmly against his shoulder blade while 2 county deputies rushed through the front door. He kept yelling, "This old man attacked me. Arrest him." But the deputies weren't looking at him. They were looking at me. One of them noticed the way I controlled Brad's wrist without hurting him. The positioning, the calm breathing, the absolute situational awareness. Military men recognize certain things in each other, even after decades. One deputy looked at me carefully and asked, "Sir, were you service?" I stared straight ahead. "Retired Navy." That was all I said. I didn't mention the SEAL teams, Panama, Afghanistan, or the men I buried. At 68, you realize silence is a shield. You spend the second half of your life trying to forget the first 3 years earlier. Nobody in our family would have believed things could end this way. Especially not Brad. Brad Jenkins was 39 years old, tall, with an expensive haircut, white teeth, and loud opinions about everything. He sold luxury trucks outside Wilmington and carried himself like a man who believed the world owed him applause for entering a room. When he first married my daughter Alice, I tried hard to like him. Truth is, I wanted to like him. After my wife Martha died from breast cancer 12 years ago, Alice was all I had left. So when she brought Brad home smiling like a teenager again, I ignored a lot of things that bothered me. The bragging, the drinking, the way he interrupted her constantly, and the way she laughed nervously whenever he teased her. I told myself all young couples had rough edges. That was my first mistake. I'm Donald Miller, 68 years old, retired, a widower living in a small coastal town in North Carolina where everybody fishes, everybody attends church on Sunday, and everybody pretends family problems stop at the front porch. Most folks know me as the quiet old man with the Ford pickup and the Labrador named Rocky. They see me buying tomatoes at the market, fixing lawnmowers for neighbors, or sitting alone at the diner drinking black coffee. That's all they see, and honestly, I preferred it that way. I spent 26 years inside Naval Special Warfare. By the time I retired, I'd had enough noise, enough funerals, enough adrenaline to last several lifetimes. Peace became precious, or at least I thought I had peace. The first time I noticed something wrong with Alice's marriage was Thanksgiving 2 years ago. Alice loved cooking with her mother, Martha, who taught her everything. That Thanksgiving, Alice accidentally overcooked the turkey a little. Nothing dramatic, just a little dry, that's all. Brad carved one slice, smirked, and said loudly, "Well, good thing you're pretty, Alice, because you sure aren't winning Top Chef." Everybody chuckled awkwardly. Alice laughed too, but I noticed something. Her shoulders tightened immediately, like she'd been hit before the joke even landed. Years in the teams teach you to watch tiny reactions. Tiny reactions tell the truth. I started paying closer attention after that. At Christmas, Brad mocked the sweater Alice wore. At family dinners, he corrected her stories constantly. "That's not how it happened. You always exaggerate. Alice is terrible with details. Small humiliations, constant little cuts. And every time Alice smiled through it, that worried me more than if she'd fought back." One July evening, I invited them over for barbecue. Brad had already been drinking before he arrived. He watched me flipping burgers beside the grill and laughed. "You know, Donald, you're the calmest old man I've ever met." I smiled politely. "Nah," he said, "just saying. Most retired military guys never shut up about it. You barely mention it. What did you even do in the Navy? File paperwork?" I shrugged. "Something like that." He pointed his beer bottle toward me. "See, that's what I mean. Alice acts like you're some kind of secret badass. I think old military stories are mostly exaggerated." The backyard went quiet. I simply flipped another burger. No anger, no reaction. Men like Brad feed on reactions. Without one, they feel invisible. A few minutes later, Alice came inside to help me carry plates. The moment we were alone, she whispered, "I'm sorry, Dad." I looked at her carefully. There was a faint bruise near her wrist, covered halfway by makeup. My stomach tightened. "What happened there?" She instantly pulled her sleeve down. "Nothing. Please, Dad. That word. Please. Not defensive, not irritated, afraid. And suddenly I knew. But it wasn't just the physical threats. Brad had started putting financial pressure on her. My late wife, Martha, had left a 12-acre coastal property to Alice in her will, a beautiful stretch of land near the water that had been in our family for generations. Brad had been pressing Alice to sell it to a developer he knew from Wilmington, but she refused, wanting to keep it for our 10-year-old grandson, Leo. Brad hated that. He believed the land was a waste, and he wanted the cash to buy into a new partnership at his luxury truck dealership. He started demanding that Alice sign a power of attorney, giving him control over her inheritance. Alice refused, but the pressure was grinding her down. That night, after everyone left, I sat alone in my garage workshop. I opened an old wooden storage chest I hadn't touched in years. Inside were photographs of men long dead, challenge coins, service medals, and one laminated card. Emergency communication codes. When Alice was 16, I taught her basic safety signals. If she ever felt unsafe and couldn't speak openly, she could send simple coded phrases. We treated it like a game, but I made her memorize one rule. If you ever send the real distress code, I come immediately, no questions asked. Around midnight on that Tuesday in October, my phone buzzed beside my chair. A text from Alice. "Dad, did you leave your blue tackle box in my garage?" Underneath it, 391. My blood went cold. 391 meant only one thing: immediate danger. Call police. I stood up, walked to my gun safe, and opened it. I drove through the storm toward her house, my headlights cutting through sheets of water, my phone on speaker with 911 dispatch. The dispatcher told me to wait for officers. "No," I answered quietly. "I won't be doing that." I hung up and pulled into their driveway, hearing the screaming from inside. The rain was easing into a steady drizzle by the time I pulled up across the street from their home. All the downstairs lights were on. I could hear Brad shouting before I even opened my truck door. He was drunk, raging, and his voice carried a sharp, ugly edge that made my knuckles turn white. I crossed the wet lawn silently. At 68, my knees ache in cold weather, but training never really leaves your body. The awareness, the balance, the timing, they all stay. As I approached the front window, I saw Alice backed against the kitchen counter, crying. There was blood on her lower lip. Brad stood inches from her face, screaming while shattered glass from a broken wine bottle littered the floor. He grabbed her wrist hard enough to make her stumble. I moved to the side gate leading to the backyard. The patio door wasn't fully closed, the curtains blowing softly in the wet wind. I entered silently. Brad didn't notice me until Alice looked past him, her eyes widening. "Dad," she whispered. Brad spun around, laughing. He was slurring his words. "Look who's here, Captain America. Did you come to save the day, Walt?" I kept walking toward him, my voice perfectly flat. "Step away from my daughter, Brad." He scoffed, taking a step toward me. "Or what? You're a retired nobody hiding in a garage." The moment his right shoulder dipped forward, instinct took over. It was a single, fluid motion. I redirected his arm, rotated behind him, and drove him face first into the hardwood floor before he could swing. I pinned his wrist behind his back, applying just enough pressure to control him. Brad thrashed in shock, screaming curses, but he couldn't move. The whole confrontation lasted maybe 30 seconds before blue and red police lights flashed across the living room windows. 2 county deputies rushed through the front door, weapons drawn. Brad yelled, "Arrest him! He attacked me!" But the older deputy noticed my calm breathing and my controlled restraint. He lowered his weapon. "Sir, can you stand up slowly for me?" I nodded and rose, while the younger deputy immediately handcuffed Brad. Reading him his rights over his furious shouting, Alice collapsed into tears against the counter, and I wrapped a blanket from the sofa around her shoulders, holding her close. "You're safe now," I whispered. The next morning, I woke before sunrise out of old habit and made coffee. Rocky lay near the back door, his ears perking up as Alice came downstairs wearing one of my old Navy sweatshirts. Her lip looked worse in the daylight, purple and swollen. She avoided my eyes as she poured coffee. "I'm sorry, Dad," she whispered. I frowned. "For what?" "For all of this. I should have left him earlier." I sat down across from her. "Fear makes people stay in bad places, Alice. You don't owe me an apology." She stared into her mug, tears pooling. "I didn't want you to think I failed. You and Mom seemed so strong. I was ashamed I chose the wrong man." Hearing those words cut straight through me. I spent decades compartmentalizing pain, staying emotionally detached to survive in the teams. After Martha died, I had buried myself in work, leaving Alice to handle her grief alone. I realized my own emotional distance had contributed to her silence. Everybody chooses the wrong people sometimes, Alice, I said gently. Your mother and I had our struggles too. You didn't fail. Later that afternoon, we sat on the back porch watching the rain drift across the marsh. Alice finally started talking openly. She explained how Brad's behavior had shifted slowly over their 3 years of marriage. It started with subtle criticisms of her friends, then her clothes, then the way she spoke. If dinner wasn't ready on time, he would give her the silent treatment. Then came the yelling, and finally, the financial pressure. It wasn't just that he wanted me to sell the land, Dad, Alice said, her voice shaking as she pulled a folder from her bag. Yesterday, I found these in his desk drawer. He forged my signature on a quitclaim deed. I took the papers from her. It was a deed transferring her inherited interest in our 12-acre coastal property to a shell corporation called Vanguard Holdings. Brad's name was listed as the managing partner. Attached to it was a forged notary stamp. My blood ran cold as I looked at the signature. It looked like Alice's handwriting, but the loops on the letters were slightly off. Brad had already filed the paperwork with the county registry of deeds 2 weeks ago. He had used the forged deed to secure a $250,000 commercial loan to buy into the luxury truck dealership. He told me that if I ever tried to leave him or tell you, he would make sure we lost the land and went bankrupt. Alice whispered, her hands trembling. He said he had the legal rights now, and nobody would believe a retired old man and his emotional daughter over a successful businessman. I stared at the forged deed. Brad was trying to steal my family's legacy and destroy my daughter's future using papers, lies, and intimidation. I felt a cold, disciplined anger rising inside me. I looked at Alice and squeezed her hand. He's wrong, Alice. A forged document is void from the beginning. In the law, they call it void ab initio. We're going to fight this. That evening, Detective Megan Ross came to the house. She sat at my kitchen table, reviewing the quitclaim deed and the bank documents Alice had found. This is big, Donald, Detective Ross said, looking up. We're not just looking at domestic assault anymore. This is felony forgery under North Carolina General Statutes Section 14-119 and obtaining property by false pretenses. If we can prove this signature is forged, the entire transfer is void, and the bank will call in the loan immediately. How do we prove it? Alice asked. We'll need a forensic document examiner, Detective Ross replied. The domestic violence charges will keep him in custody for now, but this financial fraud is what will put him away for a long time. Over the next few weeks, the house became a quiet headquarters. Detective Ross put us in touch with Gary Thornton, a certified forensic document examiner who had spent 30 years analyzing fraudulent papers for the state police. He came to my house on a rainy Thursday afternoon, carrying a leather case filled with magnifying lamps, special blue lights, and high-resolution cameras. Alice spent hours sitting at the kitchen table, writing her signature dozens of times on blank sheets of paper to provide what Gary called exemplars. I watched her from the kitchen counter. Her hand trembled at first, but with each line she wrote, her posture became steadier. It was as if she were reclaiming a piece of herself that Brad had slowly stolen over the years. Gary examined the exemplars under a special microscope, noting the pressure of her pen, the exact angle of her slant, and the spacing between letters. He explained that a person's handwriting is like a fingerprint. Even the most skilled forgers leave telltale signs of hesitation, what he called tremor lines, while we waited for the forensic analysis. I took the advice of my old friend Roy Campbell, a retired Marine who had been trying to drag me out of my garage for years. He convinced me to attend the Wednesday morning breakfast at the VFW Hall. Walking into that room filled with the smell of strong coffee, burnt toast, and maple syrup was the first time in years I felt a sense of belonging outside my own fence. We sat at long folding tables under fluorescent lights. These were men who had seen the worst of the world, yet they laughed louder than anyone I knew. We didn't talk about combat, the jungles, or the operations that kept us awake at night. Instead, we talked about grandchildren, bad knees, our blood pressure medications, and boats that refused to start. I sat there drinking black coffee, listening to their dry humor, and realized that isolating myself after Martha's death had been a mistake. I was finally choosing to live again, not just survive. 10 days later, Gary Thornton's report arrived. It was definitive. The signature on the quitclaim deed was a photocopy and paste forgery, executed with a high-resolution scanner. More importantly, the notary public, whose stamp appeared on the deed, testified that she had never met Alice and that her logbook had no record of the transaction. The notary's stamp had been cloned from a document Alice and Brad had signed for their car loan months earlier. It was a clear violation of North Carolina General Statutes, Section 1401 and 19. When the preliminary hearing was scheduled for late October, I did something I hadn't done since my wife Martha's funeral 12 years ago. I climbed into the attic and brought down my navy dress uniform. The white fabric smelled faintly of cedar and age. As I pinned my medals onto the chest one by one, memories of the men I'd served with came rushing back. The Silver Star, the service ribbons. They were heavy with the weight of the past. I didn't wear it out of vanity. I wore it because Alice needed to know she was backed by something honorable, and Brad needed to understand exactly who he had been threatening. The morning of the hearing was gray and damp, the kind of Carolina weather that settles deep into your joints. Alice sat beside me in the hallway of the courthouse, clutching a paper cup of coffee. She was quiet, her shoulders tense, but there was a new resolve in her eyes. The fear was still there, but it was no longer in control. When we entered the courtroom, Brad looked different. The luxury truck salesman who had mocked me at my own grill was gone. He sat at the defense table in a wrinkled orange jumpsuit from the county jail, his expensive haircut messy, dark circles deep under his eyes. His parents sat in the row behind him, looking exhausted and humiliated. Brad's jaw tightened the moment he saw me walk in, wearing my full dress whites. For the first time since I'd met him, I saw genuine doubt in his eyes. Brad's defense attorney immediately went on the offensive. He painted Brad as a successful businessman who had simply cracked under the immense stress of a failing marriage. He pointed at me, claiming I was a dangerous retired vigilante who had used excessive force to settle a family dispute. Mr. Miller acted outside the law, the lawyer argued. He broke into my client's home and physically assaulted him, causing severe bruising. The prosecutor, a sharp young woman named Sarah Davis, simply smiled. She played the body cam footage from the responding deputies. The courtroom watched in silence as the kitchen scene filled the screens. There I was on camera, calm, perfectly controlled, pinning Brad to the floor without striking him or causing unnecessary harm. Brad's drunken screams of, "I'll ruin you both," echoed through the speakers, followed by the image of Alice against the counter, with blood on her lip. The defense attorney's argument evaporated in seconds. But the prosecutor wasn't finished. She presented Gary Thornton's forensic report and the fraudulent quitclaim deed. She detailed how Brad had used the forged document to obtain the $250,000 commercial loan, constituting a major fraud against the bank. Then, Alice took the stand. Her voice shook at first, but she steadied herself. She described the 3 years of emotional isolation, the constant insults, and the night Brad shoved her when she discovered the forged deed. "My father didn't assault Brad," Alice said, looking directly at the judge. "He saved my life. Brad forged my signature to steal my mother's land, and he threatened to destroy us if I spoke the truth." The judge, a stern woman with sharp eyes, listened intently, taking notes as Alice spoke. She asked the defense if they had any explanation for the forensic findings, but the lawyer remained quiet, looking down at his notepad. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. The judge, a stern woman with sharp eyes, reviewed the documents on her bench for what felt like an eternity. The courtroom remained so quiet you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Finally, she looked up, her gaze resting on Brad and his attorney. "The evidence presented today is more than sufficient," she declared, her voice echoing off the paneled walls. "The forensic document examiner's report leaves no doubt that the signature on the quitclaim deed was forged. Mr. Jenkins, you are bound over for trial on charges of felony forgery under North Carolina General Statutes, Section 14-119, obtaining property by false pretenses, and misdemeanor domestic assault. Bail is set at $150,000, and a domestic violence protective order, a DVPO under Chapter 50B, is hereby granted, effective immediately. You are to have zero contact with the victim or her family. Brad slumped in his chair, his hands trembling as the bailiffs stood behind him. His parents sat in the gallery, their heads bowed. As the deputies led him out of the courtroom back to the holding cells, he didn't look at his parents. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and residual anger. I stood tall in my dress whites, my face completely expressionless. I had seen far worse men than Brad Jenkins break under pressure. During the recess, as we walked out to the hallway, the prosecutor, Sarah Davis, approached me near the vending machines. She looked at the silver star pinned to my jacket and smiled faintly. "My brother was Marine Recon," she said, her voice lowering slightly. "I thought I recognized that posture. Your restraint in the kitchen that night saved this case, Mr. Miller. If you had lost your temper and hurt him, the defense would have turned this into a story about a violent veteran. You gave them nothing to work with." I gave her a small nod. "Revenge is loud," I replied. "Control is what keeps people safe." She smiled, shaking my hand. "We'll get the final conviction. The bank is already preparing to rescind the loan based on the forgery." The next 6 weeks passed in a slow, steady blur. The court formally issued the order declaring the quitclaim deed, void ab initio, null and void from the beginning. It was a victory, but it was just the start of a long process. The bank rescinded the $250,000 commercial loan they had granted Brad, which meant the dealership had to freeze his assets to protect themselves. Brad was facing ruin, both legally and financially, but Alice and I didn't care about the money. We cared about the peace. Healing is a slow, uneven road. Some mornings Alice would wake up early, make breakfast, and talk about her plans to go back to work. Other mornings she would sit on the porch for hours, staring out at the water, her eyes empty. I learned to give her space. In the military we called it recovery time. You don't rush a soldier who has just walked out of a minefield. You let them rest. You let them realize the ground under their feet isn't going to blow up. The final sentencing hearing took place on a crisp morning in December. The gray skies of October had turned into a cold, clear winter blue. Alice decided she wanted to be there. She needed to see the end of it. I wore my dress whites again, the uniform clean and crisp. Inside the courtroom, Brad looked even smaller than he had at the preliminary hearing. He was wearing the same orange jumpsuit, his shoulders hunched. The arrogance was entirely gone, replaced by a quiet, desperate exhaustion. His lawyer made a brief plea for leniency, citing Brad's clean record and his struggles with alcohol. But the judge was unimpressed. She looked toward me. "Mr. Miller, as the victim's father and a witness to the assault, do you wish to make a statement?" I stood up slowly. Every joint in my 68-year-old body reminded me of the miles I'd traveled, but my voice remained steady, the same voice I had used to command men in dangerous places. "I spent 26 years inside naval special warfare," I began, looking first at the judge, then turning my gaze directly to Brad. "I have seen violence in many forms. I have seen war, death, and the wreckage they leave behind. And in all those years I learned one important truth. Strength has nothing to do with making people afraid of you." A few people in the gallery shifted in their seats. Brad kept his eyes locked on the table in front of him. "Real strength," I continued, "is protecting the people who cannot protect themselves. It is standing between the vulnerable and the threat. Brad Jenkins used his position as a husband to humiliate, control, and steal from my daughter. He thought that because I was a quiet old man, I was weak. He was wrong. I don't hate Brad. I hate what he did and I hate what he became. But hatred spreads damage forever if you feed it. I am not asking for vengeance today. I am asking for accountability." The judge nodded slowly, her expression grave. She delivered the sentence. 3 years in state prison for the felony forgery and bank fraud, followed by 2 years of supervised probation, mandatory alcohol rehabilitation, and a permanent restraining order. As the deputies moved to lead Brad away, he stopped near the exit. He looked back at Alice. Tears of regret filled his eyes and he whispered, "I'm sorry." Alice didn't answer. She didn't need to. She simply squeezed my hand, her grip tight and steady. The trembling was gone. As the heavy double doors of the courtroom clicked shut behind him, The fear that had lived in her eyes for 3 years was finally gone, replaced by a quiet, solid peace. Winter passed slowly after the trial. That is the thing about healing at our age. Nothing happens quickly anymore. Not recovery, not trust, not forgiveness. Everything arrives one careful, deliberate step at a time. By February, the cold Carolina rain had finally given way to softer, milder mornings. The trees behind my property began showing hints of green again, and Alice slowly started rebuilding the pieces of her life. She found a small, quiet apartment downtown above a flower shop run by Sylvia, a warm, elderly widow who treated everyone like family. The place wasn't fancy, but it was safe. Sunlight filled the kitchen in the mornings, and the smell of fresh soil and blossoms drifted up through the floorboards. Safety becomes beautiful after years of chaos. Alice also started working part-time at the public library. At first, she worried that people in town would whisper about the trial and the forgery, but small southern towns surprise you sometimes. Most folks treated her gently, especially the older women who had lived long enough to recognize pain without needing to ask about it. One afternoon, while we were having coffee on my porch, Alice looked out over the marsh and admitted, "I thought everybody would judge me for staying with him for so long." I stirred cream into my mug slowly. "Most people over 60 have survived something painful in their lives," I said. "That changes how they see others. They don't judge. They understand." She nodded, a soft tear rolling down her cheek. "I still feel embarrassed sometimes." I reached over and patted her hand. "That feeling might stay for a while, Alice. But shame fades much faster when it is exposed to love instead of secrecy." As for me, my life changed too. For years after retiring, I had isolated myself, using my routine as a hiding place. Hardware store, fishing pier, television, garage, repeat. But after everything that happened with Alice, the silence in my house no longer felt peaceful. It felt lonely. So, I kept going to the Wednesday morning breakfasts with Roy Campbell and the other veterans at the VFW. Turns out, old soldiers laugh more than civilians expect. We talked about grandchildren, bad knees, and boats that refused to start. Veterans don't spend their old age reliving glory. Mostly, we spend it appreciating ordinary peace. By springtime, my 10-year-old grandson, Leo, was coming over almost every Sunday. Before the divorce proceedings, Brad had rarely allowed him to visit me alone, claiming I was too old-fashioned and disciplined. Now, Leo ran through my backyard like he owned the place, his laughter echoing across the marsh. Rocky would chase him until they both collapsed onto the grass, exhausted. Children recover from tension faster than adults if you give them a safe place early enough. One afternoon, Leo and I sat on the edge of the dock, our fishing lines trailing in the quiet water. He studied his plastic bobber carefully before looking up at me. "Mom says you were in the Navy, Grandpa," he said. "I was," I replied, smiling. "Like a real Navy SEAL, something like that." He grinned, showing his missing front tooth. "Mom says you tackled Dad like Batman." I laughed, shaking my head. "Well, your mother exaggerates a little." We sat in silence for a minute, the dragonflies skimming the water. Then Leo asked softly, "Why was Dad so mean? Did he hate Mom?" It was the question I knew was coming, the one every child of divorce eventually asks. I looked out over the calm water before answering. "Sometimes people carry anger they never learned to control, Leo," I said carefully. "Your dad didn't hate your mom. But some people confuse love with ownership. They think they have to control someone to keep them." Leo considered that seriously, then nodded slowly, understanding more than most adults realize. A few minutes later, his bobber went under, and he pulled in a small bluegill, his face lighting up with pride. I looked at him and said, "You know what real strength is, Leo? It's making the people around you feel safe." In early summer, Alice came over carrying a white envelope with no return address, only a prison stamp. It was a handwritten letter from Brad. Alice sat beside me at the kitchen table as I opened it. The handwriting was messy, written in blue ballpoint pen. There were no excuses in it, no self-pity, and no anger. He admitted his drinking, his insecurity, and his desperate need for control. One sentence stood out. "I spent years trying to feel powerful by making other people smaller." Alice looked at me nervously as I folded the letter. "What do you think, Dad?" she asked. "I think remorse is painful when it is real," I said. "Do you forgive him?" she asked. That question sat heavily in the quiet room. At my age, I've learned forgiveness isn't a light switch, I replied. It's a decision you have to practice repeatedly. I don't know if I'm there yet, but I'm working on it. Alice nodded. Then, she looked at me with tears in eyes. Thank you for saving me. I squeezed her hand. You saved yourself, sweetheart. You had the courage to send the code and ask for help. That is the hardest part. A few Sundays later, we gathered for dinner at my house. Fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and cornbread. The kitchen was filled with the sound of laughter and dishes clattering. Sitting there at that old wooden table, watching Alice smile and listening to Leo tell a story, I finally understood what took me nearly 7 decades to learn. When I was young, I thought strength meant winning fights. Then war taught me strength meant surviving pain. But getting older taught me the real truth. Strength is answering the phone when someone you love is afraid. Strength is staying calm when anger would feel easier. Strength is protecting your family without losing your humanity in the process. And sometimes, strength is allowing yourself to heal too. If this story meant something to you tonight, if you've ever loved someone through pain, protected your family, or learned hard lessons later in life, I hope you'll share it. And remember, no matter your age, it is never too late to choose kindness over control, peace over pride, and love over fear.